Vivien Leigh was the most beautiful woman in cinema, but beauty was never her burden. Madness was. In the summer of 1967, she sat alone in her London flat, staring at two golden Oscar statues that had once represented the pinnacle of achievement, but now felt like tombstones marking dreams that had died before she did. At 53, the woman who had conquered the world as Scarlett O'Hara was being conquered by demons that no amount of talent, beauty, or acclaim could exorcise. The telephone had stopped ringing. The scripts had stopped arriving. The man she had loved more than sanity itself, Laurence Olivier, had long since departed, taking with him the last fragments of her carefully constructed public persona. What remained was the raw, unfiltered truth that Hollywood had spent decades helping her hide. Vivien Leigh was brilliant, breathtaking, and slowly losing her mind. This wasn't just another story of a star who burned too bright and flamed out too quickly. This was something more complex and tragic. The account of a woman who had achieved everything the entertainment industry promised would bring happiness. 2 Academy Awards, international acclaim, marriage to the most celebrated actor of her generation, only to discover that external perfection could not heal internal fractures. The world remembered Vivien as Scarlett O'Hara, the Southern belle who declared she would never be hungry again, or as Blanche DuBois, the faded beauty who depended on the kindness of strangers. But the woman behind these iconic performances was someone entirely different. A brilliant actress who used other people's scripted lives to escape the unscripted chaos of her own mind. By the time tuberculosis claimed her in July 1967, Vivien had spent nearly 3 decades hiding a secret that would have destroyed her career if revealed. She suffered from bipolar disorder in an era when mental illness was not just stigmatized, but considered a moral failing. She had performed sanity as skillfully as she had performed Shakespeare, and the exhaustion of maintaining both personas had slowly killed her. But to understand how someone could achieve everything the world valued most highly while simultaneously losing everything that actually mattered, we must return to the beginning. To a young woman in British India who learned early that being extraordinary was both a gift and a curse, who discovered that perfection was a performance that required sacrificing authenticity, and who would spend her entire adult life searching for something real in a world built on beautiful lies. The story begins not with stardom, but with a question that would haunt Vivien Leigh her entire life. If you can become anyone on stage, why can't you escape who you are when the curtain falls? November 5th, 1913. Vivien Mary Hartley was born in Darjeeling, British India, into a world where appearance was everything and emotional authenticity was dangerous. Her father was a British cavalry officer, her mother a starstruck woman who saw in her daughter's extraordinary beauty the possibility of living vicariously through someone else's success. From her earliest memories, Vivien understood that she was valued primarily for her ability to embody other people's fantasies rather than express her own reality. The colonial setting of her childhood was crucial to understanding the woman she would become. British India in the 1910s was a society built on performance, the performance of racial superiority, cultural dominance, and emotional control. Children were raised to believe that showing genuine feeling was weakness, that maintaining perfect appearances was more important than acknowledging imperfect truths. Vivien's early years were spent learning to be what others needed her to be. Her parents' marriage was troubled, marked by long separations and carefully concealed tensions, but she was taught to present their family as the picture of colonial respectability. She learned to smile when she felt sad, to appear confident when she felt confused, and to perform happiness when her parents' relationship filled the house with an atmosphere of barely contained desperation. But even as a child, Vivien displayed signs of the intense emotional volatility that would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. She experienced periods of manic energy when she would stay awake for days, creating elaborate fantasy worlds and performing impromptu theatrical productions for anyone who would watch. These episodes were followed by crashes into depression so profound that she would refuse to speak or eat, staring blankly at walls as if searching for escape routes that didn't exist. Her parents interpreted these extreme mood swings as evidence of artistic temperament rather than mental illness. In their world, eccentricity was acceptable if it served a purpose, and Vivien's theatrical abilities were already remarkable enough to suggest a future in entertainment. They encouraged her dramatic tendencies while simultaneously teaching her to hide the darker aspects of her emotional life. The decision to send her to boarding school in England was presented as an opportunity for better education. But it was also an attempt to provide structure for a child whose internal life seemed increasingly chaotic. The separation from her parents was traumatic, but it also gave Vivien her first taste of the relief that would come from performing versions of herself that were more acceptable than her authentic emotions. Could this early training in emotional suppression have been what eventually made both her greatest performances and her greatest personal struggles possible? At school, Vivien discovered that her ability to inhabit other identities wasn't just a survival mechanism. It was a genuine gift. She could become anyone the situation required. The perfect student when teachers were watching. The rebellious leader when peers needed inspiration. The grieving daughter when letters from India brought news of family troubles. But she was also learning that the cost of this adaptability was an increasing disconnection from any stable sense of self. Her teenage years brought the full flowering of her beauty, but also the full weight of expectations that came with such extraordinary physical gifts. Teachers and classmates treated her differently because of her appearance, and she began to understand that being beautiful meant being constantly observed, analyzed, and reduced to a collection of physical attributes, rather than recognized as a complex human being. The pressure to leverage her beauty into some form of success was enormous. Her mother's letters from India were filled with suggestions about modeling, acting, and marriage, all paths that would capitalize on Vivien's appearance while requiring her to subordinate her intelligence and emotional complexity to other people's desires. She was being groomed to be a beautiful object rather than a thinking subject. But Vivien was also developing interests that had nothing to do with her appearance. She was a voracious reader, particularly drawn to Shakespeare and classical literature, fascinated by characters who struggled with the gap between their public personas and private realities. She wrote constantly. Poetry, short stories, diary entries that revealed someone trying to understand whether it was possible to be both beautiful and authentic in a world that seemed to require choosing between the two. The decision to pursue acting wasn't born from a love of performance. It was born from the recognition that acting was the only profession where her natural ability to become other people might be valued rather than seen as evidence of instability. If she was going to spend her life hiding her real self anyway, she might as well get paid for it. From the very beginning, Vivien understood something about acting that many of her contemporaries missed. The most powerful performances came not from pretending to be someone else, but from finding the parts of yourself that resonated with the character and amplifying them until they became larger than life. Her mental illness, rather than being an obstacle to her craft, became its secret weapon. The transformation from Vivien Hartley to Vivien Leigh was more than just a name change. It was the creation of an entirely new identity designed to be more marketable than the complicated reality of her actual personality. Vivien Leigh was beautiful, charming, and talented, but she was also emotionally stable, professionally reliable, and romantically available in ways that the real Vivien could never consistently be. The early days of her career in London theater were both exhilarating and exhausting. Vivien was finally using her natural gifts professionally, but she was also learning that success in entertainment required maintaining her constructed persona even when the cameras weren't rolling. She had to be Vivien Leigh at auditions, at parties, at interviews, and increasingly even in private moments when the line between performance and reality became dangerously blurred. Her first marriage, to Herbert Lee Holman, was as much about creating a stable public image as it was about genuine affection. Holman was respectable, financially secure, and completely uninterested in the theatrical world. Exactly the kind of husband that would make Vivien appear grounded and normal rather than volatile and unpredictable. The marriage gave her social credibility while providing a safe space where she could occasionally drop her professional mask. But even domestic tranquility couldn't contain the increasingly extreme mood swings that characterized her mental illness. During manic episodes, Vivien would disappear from home for days, throwing herself into work with an intensity that worried colleagues and friends. During depressive periods, she would be unable to function, lying in bed for weeks while her carefully constructed career momentum threatened to collapse entirely. The birth of her daughter Suzanne should have provided the grounding that Vivien desperately needed, but motherhood only added another layer of performance to her already overwhelming repertoire. She had to be not just a successful actress and a charming wife, but also a devoted mother, and all while battling mental illness that made consistent emotional availability nearly impossible. The strain was beginning to show, but Vivien had become expert at hiding her struggles behind increasingly polished public appearances. She was developing the skills that would later make her one of the greatest actresses of her generation. But she was also slowly losing touch with any authentic sense of self beneath all the carefully crafted roles. It was during this period of professional building and personal fragmentation that she encountered the man who would change everything. Laurence Olivier, the most celebrated Shakespearean actor of his generation, and someone whose own complicated relationship with performance and reality would prove both perfectly complementary and ultimately destructive to her own psychological stability. The meeting was inevitable. Two of Britain's most talented performers orbiting the same theatrical circles. But the attraction was immediate and devastating. Here was someone who understood the intoxicating power of becoming other people professionally, while struggling to remain yourself personally. The affair that began between Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier in 1936 was more than just two married people falling in love. It was the collision of two people who had spent their entire adult lives performing versions of themselves that were more appealing than their authentic personalities. Their relationship would become the greatest love story and the greatest tragedy of both their lives. The chemistry between Vivien and Olivier was evident to everyone who saw them together. But it was also dangerously volatile. Both were perfectionists who demanded excellence from themselves and others. Both were struggling with the psychological costs of constant performance, and both were emotionally intense in ways that could be either inspiring or destructive depending on circumstances. When they were cast together in Fire Over England in 1937, their professional collaboration became the public justification for what had begun as a private affair. They were able to channel their personal passion into their performances, creating an electric dynamic on screen that audiences found irresistible. But they were also feeding each other's tendency toward emotional extremes, encouraging behaviors that might have been moderated by more stable partners. The decision to leave their respective spouses and pursue their relationship publicly was scandalous by 1930s standards, but it was also professionally calculated. Two rising stars in love was a marketable story, and their combined talents were attracting attention from Hollywood producers who saw box office potential in their romance. The move to America and the audition for Gone with the Wind represented everything that Vivien had been working towards since childhood. The opportunity to use her beauty, talent, and carefully constructed persona to achieve international stardom. But it also represented the ultimate test of whether she could maintain her performance of sanity under the most intense pressure imaginable. The casting process for Scarlett O'Hara was exhausting and humiliating, requiring Vivien to audition repeatedly while competing against hundreds of other actresses who were often more experienced and better connected. But her obsessive preparation and her ability to embody complex characters gave her an advantage that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with her psychological sophistication. When she was finally cast as Scarlett, Vivien understood that she had achieved something unprecedented. The opportunity to play a character whose emotional volatility, desperate need for control, and tendency toward manipulation were not that different from her own personality traits. She could use her mental illness as a resource rather than hide it as a liability. Behind all that glamour and global attention, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The filming of Gone with the Wind was both the pinnacle of Vivien's career and the beginning of her most serious psychological decline. The pressure to deliver a performance worthy of the most anticipated film in history triggered manic episodes that she channeled into Scarlett's fierce determination. But it also triggered depressive crashes that left her unable to function between takes. Director Victor Fleming and producer David O. Selznick were aware that their leading lady was struggling with emotional instability. But they were more concerned with protecting their investment than protecting Vivien's health. As long as she could deliver the performance they needed, her personal suffering was considered an acceptable cost of creating cinematic history. The success of the film should have been pure triumph, but the Academy Award for Best Actress came with a level of scrutiny and expectation that made maintaining her carefully constructed public persona increasingly difficult. Vivien was now one of the most recognizable faces in the world, which meant that every public appearance was analyzed for signs of the emotional volatility that she was working desperately to hide. More troubling was the growing recognition that her greatest professional achievement had been built on the exploitation of her mental illness. The qualities that made her Scarlett so compelling, the emotional intensity, the desperate hunger for control, the ability to perform charm while feeling rage, were the same symptoms that were slowly destroying her private life. The marriage to Olivier, which had begun as a grand romance, was becoming complicated by their competing career demands and her increasingly unpredictable behavior. He loved the brilliant, beautiful woman she could be during stable periods, but he struggled to cope with the darkness and chaos that characterized her episodes of depression and mania. Their professional collaborations continued to be successful. They were genuinely talented performers who brought out the best in each other's craft. But their personal relationship was beginning to crack under the weight of expectations, professional pressures, and the exhaustion that came from constantly performing happiness while battling mental illness. The outbreak of World War II provided a welcome distraction from these personal struggles, allowing both of them to channel their energies into war relief efforts and performances for troops. But it also separated them for long periods, leaving Vivien alone with her increasingly severe mood swings and no healthy coping mechanisms for managing them. By the time she was cast in A Streetcar Named Desire in 1947, Vivien had achieved everything that was supposed to guarantee happiness: international fame, critical acclaim, marriage to a celebrated partner. But she was more emotionally unstable than ever. The role of Blanche DuBois would give her another Academy Award, but it would also push her closer to the psychological breaking point that had been threatening for decades. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew her well. Vivien's greatest performances were becoming increasingly indistinguishable from her mental illness, and her mental illness was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from her greatest performances. The preparation for Blanche DuBois was both artistic triumph and personal catastrophe for Vivien Leigh. Tennessee Williams had created a character who was beautiful, intelligent, and slowly losing her grip on reality, essentially writing a role that allowed Vivien to explore her own psychological landscape while calling it professional research. The parallels between actress and character were so obvious that they were disturbing. Like Blanche, Vivien was a woman whose beauty had been both blessing and curse, who had learned to perform versions of herself that were more appealing than her authentic emotions, and who was struggling to maintain sanity in a world that valued appearance over substance. The difference was that Blanche's madness was scripted and contained within the boundaries of theatrical performance, while Vivien's was real and increasingly uncontrollable. Director Elia Kazan recognized that his leading lady was drawing on genuinely painful personal experiences to create her performance, but he was more interested in capturing that pain on film than in protecting her from it. The method acting approach that was becoming fashionable encouraged actors to use their own trauma as artistic material. But nobody was discussing the psychological costs of repeatedly accessing and performing your own worst moments. Olivier watched his wife disappear into the role with a mixture of admiration and horror. Her performance was becoming more powerful and more disturbing with each rehearsal, but she was also becoming less able to separate Vivien Leigh from Blanche DuBois when the rehearsal ended. The line between acting and reality was dissolving in ways that threatened not just her sanity but their marriage. Did this tragic event mark her downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point that revealed the depth of her long-hidden struggles? The filming process was intensely demanding, requiring Vivien to access extreme emotional states day after day while maintaining the professional composure that her career demanded. She was brilliant in the role, bringing a combination of vulnerability and strength to Blanche that made her both sympathetic and tragic. But the emotional toll was becoming evident to everyone around her. The Academy Award that resulted from her performance should have been validation that her suffering had been worthwhile. But instead, it felt like evidence that her value as a person was tied to her ability to transform her mental illness into entertainment for others. She was being rewarded for her pain, which made addressing that pain seem like betraying her artistic gift. The success of Streetcar established Vivien as one of the greatest actresses of her generation, but it also marked the beginning of her most serious decline. The public expected her to continue delivering performances of similar intensity, but she was running out of emotional resources to draw upon. Her mental illness was no longer just influencing her art, it was consuming her life. The relationship with Olivier was deteriorating under the pressure of her increasingly erratic behavior and his growing inability to cope with the demands of being married to someone whose moods could shift from euphoric to suicidal within hours. He had fallen in love with her talent and beauty, but he was unprepared for the reality of living with untreated bipolar disorder. Their professional collaborations continued, but they were becoming exercises in damage control rather than artistic exploration. Olivier would spend as much energy managing Vivien's episodes as directing her performances, and she would alternate between brilliant work and complete inability to function professionally. The miscarriage that ended their hope of having children together was devastating for both of them, but it was particularly crushing for Vivien, who saw it as evidence that she was too fundamentally damaged to create anything lasting or beautiful outside of her performances. The loss sent her into a depressive episode so severe that she was unable to work for months. When she finally returned to the stage, her performances had gained a new dimension of tragic depth. But her personal life had become almost entirely consumed by the management of her mental illness. She was taking pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to stabilize her moods, and alcohol to numb the emotional pain that no medication could touch. The press began to notice that something was wrong. Vivien's public appearances became less frequent and more carefully controlled. Her interviews became shorter and more scripted, and rumors began to circulate about her health and her marriage. The carefully constructed persona that had served her for decades was becoming impossible to maintain. But perhaps most troubling was the growing recognition that her mental illness had become so intertwined with her artistic identity that treating it successfully might mean sacrificing the very qualities that made her performances extraordinary. She was trapped between madness and medication, between authenticity and sanity, between being herself and being the version of herself that the world had fallen in love with. The question that haunted her final years was whether it was possible to be both a great artist and a healthy person. or whether the intensity that fueled her best work was inseparable from the illness that was slowly killing her. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Or do some people simply learn to illuminate those shadows so brilliantly that darkness becomes art? The 1950s brought a strange kind of twilight to Vivien Leigh's career. She remained one of the most celebrated actresses in the world, but she was increasingly unable to take advantage of that status because of her deteriorating mental health. The woman who had once been able to channel her emotional volatility into powerful performances was now struggling to distinguish between her professional and personal breakdowns. The dissolution of her marriage to Olivier was both inevitable and heartbreaking. He had loved her for nearly 2 decades, but he was exhausted by the constant crisis management that their relationship required and frustrated by his inability to help her find stability. The decision to separate was presented to the public as a mutual recognition of incompatibility, but privately it was an acknowledgement that love alone could not cure mental illness. Vivien's response to the divorce was characteristically extreme. Periods of manic energy where she would throw herself into work with dangerous intensity, followed by crashes into depression so profound that she would be unable to leave her bed for weeks. The pattern that had defined her entire adult life was accelerating, and the support systems that had once helped her manage it were no longer available. Living alone for the first time in decades, Vivien was forced to confront the reality of her illness without the buffer of a relationship or the distraction of constant professional demands. The woman who had spent her entire life performing for others was now alone with herself, and she discovered that she no longer knew who she was when she wasn't being someone else. The theatrical roles that came her way during this period were often perfectly suited to her psychological state. Characters who were beautiful, intelligent, and slowly losing their grip on reality. But playing these parts was becoming increasingly dangerous for someone whose own grasp on reality was so tenuous. She was being asked to perform madness while experiencing it, and the line between the two was disappearing entirely. Her health was deteriorating in other ways as well. The tuberculosis that would eventually kill her was beginning to manifest, but she ignored the symptoms because they interfered with her ability to work. She had learned to push through physical and emotional pain in service of her performances, but that determination was now working against her survival rather than supporting her art. The few friends who remained in her life watched helplessly as she alternated between brilliant lucidity and complete disconnection from reality. During her manic phases, she would be the charming, witty woman they had always known. But during her depressive episodes, she became almost catatonic, unable to engage with the world around her in any meaningful way. The medical establishment of the 1960s had little to offer someone in Vivien's condition. Psychiatric care was primitive, often involving treatments that were as traumatic as the illnesses they were meant to cure. The medications available were crude and came with side effects that made it difficult to work, which for someone whose identity was so tied to her performances felt like another form of death. More troubling was the growing recognition that seeking help for her mental illness could destroy what remained of her career. Mental illness was still considered a shameful secret in the entertainment industry, and admitting to serious psychological problems would have made her unemployable. She was trapped between the illness that was killing her and the secrecy that was necessary to maintain her livelihood. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation in a world that offered no real support for her struggles? The last years of Vivien's life were spent in a strange kind of limbo. She was still occasionally brilliant when she could summon the energy to perform, but she was increasingly isolated from the professional and personal relationships that had once sustained her. The tuberculosis was slowly destroying her lungs while the bipolar disorder continued to devastate her emotional stability. Her final performances were poignant not because they were technically perfect, but because they revealed someone who was still fighting to create beauty, even as she was being consumed by forces beyond her control. The woman who had once been able to inhabit any character was now struggling to inhabit her own life, but her commitment to her craft remained undiminished. The end, when it came on July 8, 1967, was both sudden and inevitable. Vivien died alone in her London flat, discovered by the man who had become her companion in her final years. She was 53 years old, the same age as many actresses who were just beginning to transition from leading lady roles to character parts. But she had packed several lifetimes of intensity into her 5 decades, burning through experiences and emotions at a pace that few people could sustain. The woman who had once declared that she had lived too much in too little time had proven herself prophetic. She had achieved everything that was supposed to guarantee happiness: beauty, talent, fame, critical acclaim, the love of audiences worldwide. But she had also demonstrated that external success could not heal internal wounds, that performing sanity was not the same as achieving it, and that sometimes the greatest artists are the ones who pay the highest price for their gifts. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners who came to honor not just a great actress, but a woman who had struggled heroically with demons that remained largely misunderstood by her generation. The tributes focused on her professional achievements: the 2 Academy Awards, the legendary performances, the beauty that had captivated audiences worldwide. But those who knew her best understood that her greatest achievement had been surviving as long as she had, while battling an illness that the medical establishment was only beginning to understand. July 8, 1967. The date marked not just the death of Vivien Leigh, but the end of an era when mental illness was treated as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. The woman who died that morning had spent her entire adult life hiding a secret that would have destroyed her career if revealed. Performing sanity with the same skill she brought to performing Shakespeare, and slowly killing herself in the process. The immediate response to her death revealed both the genuine affection that audiences felt for her and the complete misunderstanding of what her life had actually been like. Obituaries focused on her beauty, her talent, and her tumultuous relationship with Olivier. But they said nothing about the bipolar disorder that had shaped every aspect of her adult experience. The press coverage treated her death as the tragic but inevitable end of a life lived too intensely, as if her suffering had been a romantic choice rather than the result of untreated mental illness. The narrative that emerged was of a passionate woman who had burned too bright to last, rather than a brilliant actress who had been failed by a medical and social system that couldn't recognize or treat her condition. But those who had worked with her closely understood that Vivien's struggle had been more complex and more courageous than the public realized. She had managed to create some of the most memorable performances in cinema history, while battling an illness that made consistent emotional stability impossible. Her achievement was not just artistic but heroic. She had found ways to transform her psychological pain into performances that moved and inspired others. Was her death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Vivien's case, the hidden forces were medical ignorance, social stigma, and an entertainment industry that valued her symptoms as artistic resources while providing no support for her suffering as a human being. The estate she left behind was modest compared to other stars of her generation, partly because her illness had made consistent work difficult, and partly because she had never been primarily motivated by financial accumulation. Her most valuable possessions were her 2 Oscar statues, which became symbols not just of her professional achievement, but of the price she had paid for excellence. Her daughter Suzanne, who had grown up largely separated from her mother because of Vivien's inability to provide consistent care, inherited not just her estate but the complex legacy of being the child of someone whose mental illness had made traditional parenting impossible. The relationship between them had been loving but difficult, shaped by Vivien's unpredictable moods and her constant struggle to balance motherhood with career demands. The theatrical community's response to her death was complicated by guilt and recognition. Many of her colleagues realized that they had benefited from her illness. Her emotional intensity had made her performances more powerful. Her perfectionism had elevated the productions she appeared in. But they had done little to help her manage the personal costs of those professional gifts. In the decades following her death, Vivien's story became a case study in the relationship between mental illness and artistic genius. Scholars and biographers began to examine how her bipolar disorder had influenced her performances, how the entertainment industry had exploited her symptoms, and how different her life might have been if she had lived in an era with better understanding and treatment of mental health conditions. The gradual destigmatization of mental illness cast new light on Vivien's struggles and achievements. What had once been seen as evidence of artistic temperament was recognized as symptoms of a serious medical condition that required treatment rather than exploitation. Her story became part of larger conversations about how the entertainment industry treats performers who struggle with psychological challenges. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her legacy was the way her performances continued to resonate with audiences who recognized something authentic in her portrayal of characters struggling with internal conflicts. Her Scarlett O'Hara and Blanche DuBois remained powerful decades after her death because they captured truths about female experience that transcended the specific circumstances of their fictional stories. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind her public image? In Vivien's case, the biggest secret had been her mental illness itself. But as that became more widely acknowledged, other aspects of her story gained new significance. Her intelligence, her perfectionism, her courage in continuing to work despite her struggles, and her determination to create beauty even when her own life felt chaotic and painful. The medical community eventually recognized Vivien's case as an example of how bipolar disorder could manifest in highly creative individuals, and how the same neurological differences that contributed to mental illness might also enhance artistic ability. Her story became part of ongoing research into the relationship between creativity and mental health. The entertainment industry slowly began to develop better support systems for performers struggling with psychological challenges, though progress was gradual and often incomplete. Vivien's story served as a cautionary tale about the costs of expecting artists to sacrifice their mental health for their craft. As understanding of bipolar disorder improved, Vivien's behavior throughout her career was recontextualized. What had once been dismissed as temperamental behavior was recognized as symptoms of a serious condition. Her manic episodes explained her periods of intense productivity and her ability to deliver powerful performances under pressure. Her depressive episodes explained her withdrawal from professional and personal relationships. The ultimate question that Vivien's life raised, whether artistic genius required psychological suffering or whether her achievements might have been even greater if she had received proper treatment, remained unanswered. But her example demonstrated that mental illness and artistic excellence could coexist, that creativity could survive medical intervention, and that the most powerful art often came from the most authentic exploration of human complexity. Vivien Leigh had been one of the greatest actresses of her generation, but more importantly, she had been one of the first public figures to demonstrate that mental illness was compatible with extraordinary achievement. She had proven that people struggling with bipolar disorder could create lasting beauty, could inspire others through their work, and could maintain their humanity even when their minds betrayed them. In an industry built on carefully constructed illusions, Vivien Leigh had lived a complex truth, that genius and madness were not opposites but dance partners, that the qualities that made her performances unforgettable were inseparable from the struggles that made her life unbearable, and that sometimes the greatest art emerges from the deepest pain. If Hollywood was still confused about the relationship between mental health and creative achievement, they only had to remember Vivien Leigh, the woman who transformed her shadows into light even as they consumed her. Vivien Leigh didn't hide madness behind beauty. The industry hid madness behind beauty.